Good evening. I'm Stewart from the Long Now Foundation. Thank you for coming. There's been a couple questions what the Long Now Foundation might be. And does that sound better? Yeah, I got to really lick it. Okay. One of the reasons we open the doors for coffee at 7 o'clock and then start the lecture promptly at 8 is so that you guys have had a chance to do what you've been doing, which is schmooze and talk and buy coffee and get high and read books. And also, I suppose, get a little experience of patience. The Long Now is all about fostering long-term responsibility as a byproduct, we hope, of taking the long-term seriously. And this series of lectures, seminars about long-term thinking is about the 7th major project the Long Now Foundation has taken on since it started 10 years ago. It's based over here in the Presidio, our sort of maypole project that everything else dances around as we're building a 10,000-year clock designed by Danny Hillis. The second prototype is being built now. The first prototype is in London at the Science Museum, ticking away. And the eventual clock wants to live in a mountain in eastern Nevada with bristlecone pines 5,000 years old up on top of it. That's the iconic project. We just got a very nice grant from the National Science Foundation for a serious working project called the Rosetta Project, which is aiming to put all of the documented living languages in the world online in one place. RosettaProject.org has about 1,600 languages there now. If we get all 4,000 languages in the next couple of years, that would be great. It's the site is really a collaboration engine, so there's well over 1,000 volunteer linguists, translators, and native speakers who are helping improve the quality of the material on there. We're also involved in digital preservation and frequently collaborate with Brewster Kale over here, who's got his own spotlight. From the Internet Archive, and working with Library of Congress and others on that. There's a site called longbets.org, which is a place where you can put predictions online, and they'll stay there until they're proven wrong or right. It doesn't matter how long. And so the minimum time is 2 years, and the maximum time is, well, one of the bets is Danny Hillis's bet with Nathan Myhrvold as to whether the universe will keep expanding or not. And there's $1,000 on each side of that bet. You can put real money up. The money goes into a fund where it collects compound interest over time. So by the time some of these bets pay off, it's serious money. One of them from Peter Schwartz, who spoke last month here, is that there is someone alive now who will be alive in 2150, 150 years from now. And so that bet won't conclude until then, but the $1,000 that he and his opponent put up for that will be pretty significant money by 2150. What else are we doing? We're just starting this outreach process here, and one of the reasons I encourage you to use these cards that have a place for questions on the back. The way the questions work is anytime during the lecture or during the Q&A session, go ahead and write down a question. Put your name on it, because we'll call your name so we can see who you are when I or Kevin Kelly reads the question. But at the very bottom is something independent and even more important in some ways. This audience, probably most of you came here via email, because that's how word seems to get around for these things. So if you give us your email address, we will not do anything dangerous with it, but we will let you know about the various talks as they come along, and also supporting stuff. So, for example, we're now putting up on the Long Now website, longnow.org, where you can download previous talks. For now, audio in several different formats, eventually video, and we'll also have illustrated print versions. So the slides, of which you'll see a great many tonight, will be there along with the printed versions of the talks. We'll be making book recommendations, leading you to place on the website if you want to discuss with other people about this Long Now stuff. There's plenty of opportunity to do that. This evening, to introduce our speaker, here's Kevin Kelly.
Thank you, Stewart. So one of the reasons to have me introduce George is to have another face with the Long Now Foundation to prove this, just not Stewart. Behind this thing, there actually is a group of people who are trying to foster long-term responsibility and to encourage a long-term perspective. And in that vein, one of the things that we've discovered about trying to think about the long-term future is that some of the best futurists are actually very good historians. And George Dyson is an innovative historian of science. And he's sort of a very special character in the sense that there are, he's not only a historian of science, but he's a historian of science who enjoys taking a view of the future. And there's very few of those. The only one I can think of is H.G. Wells, who was a historian who had a really knack for thinking about the future. And in some ways, George Dyson is a lot like that. You'll hear tonight about some of George's recent work in the history of computation. And unlike most of the histories of computation that you'll hear, this is actually about the origins and genesis of software, probably the most important part of computation. So George has a very eclectic background. Unlike lots of talks, he will actually introduce the talk with some of his own biography, so I don't have to talk about that because he's going to tell you a better version of it than I could. But what he's going to do is try to take a long-term view of the trajectory of computation in the very short past, the very short now, and try to show you its general trends to indicate in some way or other what we might expect this to do. And I think that I really like George because he's a very unconventional thinker, and one of the conversations we often have are trying to amuse each other with plausible heresies. And so I think you should really enjoy this very visual presentation, and I'm hoping that George will also be able to encourage us to think about the long term in a slightly different way than we have been. So George, welcome.
Thanks, Kevin and Stewart, and all my friends in the audience. I think the future of the computing is here in the audience, not with me, but I'll tell you about how we got here, and then we can sort of guess how we move ahead. I owe Stewart an awful lot. I was a total misfit teenager in Princeton, New Jersey, when my sister, who lived down in Menlo Park, was hanging out with this bunch of people called the Mid-Peninsula Free University and doing all sorts of strange things. And then one day she sent me this little almost hand-printed pamphlet, which was the sort of the ancestor of the whole Earth catalog, and it blew my mind there. And that's when I decided I had to get out of New Jersey and head west to the real world. So there's plenty of room at the top. That's a play on Richard Feynman's great talk he gave in 1959 at Caltech. There's plenty of room at the bottom when he explained that really the thing to do is make machines smaller. And that you could make small machines that would make smaller machines that would make smaller machines. And that's of course how we have 256 megabytes on a little chip the size of your fingernail. We were actually doing that. And we moved into that space with technology, but the reverse thing can also happen, which is that life wants to move anywhere that there's sort of empty possibility space and there's this big possibility space for larger forms of life, and that's what the title's about. There's also we can have smaller computers. We can also have larger computers. The whole world can become, in a sense, a computer. Life was limited. Whales and dinosaurs were the biggest things because the nervous system you just can't go beyond much more than 100 feet, and then because otherwise you don't feel it quickly enough when somebody bites your tail. And now it's interesting that I think Danny pointed this out, that sort of the nervous twitch time between a dinosaur tail and the head is just about the same as a good connection around the world on the internet. So make of that what you will. So for me, playing in the room at the top was this treehouse that I went to, that I built and lived in when I left New Jersey and moved west. And that gave me a different sense of time scale. Living in a 200-year-old Douglas fir tree for 3 winters, really got the sense that, life just grows one ring at a time, very slowly. I wasn't making any political statement or trying to save the trees. I actually worked logging and so on. So had no great allegiance to the tree, but just it was a very cool place to live. The bottom of the tree is about way below the floor. It was 95 feet up. So that's gave me this. And my ideas about computers really all started up there. My sister was in that business, starting, being a Wall Street reporter, and would send me these analyst reports on these companies that were starting to build computers that would talk to each other and so on. That's where I got all these strange ideas, sitting up there reading that stuff. So that's me at that early young age. And what I did was build kayaks. I didn't want, anything to do with computer technology. I wanted, and I got this from Stewart Brand, and his whole Earth catalog was a reference to this book on skin boats and bark canoes in North America. And I just took that and ran with it, and built all kinds of, taking these ancient designs. So again, it was a very long-term evolution of these boats. They probably certainly go back 5,000 years, and very good case can be made they go back 10,000 years, these same designs that were first documented by the Russians who came over from Siberia into Alaska and then down south as far as here. In fact, they used to kayak in through the Golden Gate, and the Spanish, who kept their guns here at the Presidio, right just down the beach here, would shoot at them coming in the gate. So what they ended up doing was portaging over the Tennessee Valley Trail from into the head of Richardson Bay, and then paddling into the bay and trying not to get shot at when they went out. So this technology evolved in sort of a vicious circle that you had to have a fast kayak to catch these fast animals, to get the skins to build a fast kayak to go catch these animals. And that's exactly what happened with hardware and software in the computer world. We all know the cycles that you get a bigger computer, then you can run more software, and then you need a bigger computer to run that software that you thought would run on your existing computer, but you need another one. It's a very similar cycle of evolution over a long period of time. People live in the illusions for, we know for sure 8,000 or 9,000 years, probably 10,000 years, going through that technological development. This is a model kayak from a burial cave, 800 years old. It was buried with a 2-year-old child. This cave was a cave discovered a few summers ago, and that's a drawing done in one of the schools in Unalaska just at the same time. So the culture has stayed sort of in a steady state all this time. That's part of the long now, is that we live in a world that's changing so fast, but there's other worlds that have changed very slowly. This is Anangula, an island that had probably something like 3,000 people living on it, and that is the oldest known continuously inhabited settlement in North America. 8,700 years people lived on that island the same way until now. And so that's the perspective I'm coming from. My dad, who probably a lot of Freeman Dyson, was not doing kayaks, he was doing spaceships, and that was sort of my angle, was to go out and do the same thing that he was trying to do in space, but do it here on Earth. And the same as the outer planets he wanted to go to were little islands in the solar system. These were islands in the northwest that I went to, those sails using as tents. So this is to give you a sense of how technology has sort of a life of its own. These boats had a life. The Aleuts looked at their boats as living things. And so it was sort of natural that when I got my first computer, thanks to Larry here in the front row and Apple, I saw, couldn't do anything but think of sort of the life of computers as a collective thing. I built very huge kayaks. This one was sort of the monster, answering the question why kayaks shouldn't be so large. And fleets of small ones. And this is Fort Ross, again, right up on the Sonoma coast here, where the Russians had their that was their outpost. That was as far as they could come without the Spanish getting too angry at them. And then from there, they did these sort of sneaky expeditions down into San Francisco Bay to Sacramento, San Jose, cleaning out the otters. And this is one of my boats coming in through the Golden Gate. So it's very great to be back here, but I'm here to talk about the future of computing. But the way I will do that really is to show you about the past, and by putting a greater depth on the past, I think we can see a little far ahead. We can see the trends of how far we've gone in 50 years. This is 1949. John von Neumann, who's the person, I'm really going to give you his perspective on there were many people working at the dawn of computing. He was only one of them, but he was a genius, and even though he may have like a black hole, he sort of attracted more credit than he deserved, perhaps. He did deserve at least half of the credit he got. That's von Neumann at age 12. So just showing his genius very early. And belonged to a great school. This one school in Budapest, I mean, a whole handful of people who came and completely brought us the world we live in today. Edward Teller, Leo Szilard, Eugene Wigner, von Neumann, Paul Erdos, they all came out of this one high school. So there's something going on there. Like and then when he came to America, to this new outfit, started by a philanthropist, sort of a little bit of an outcast like Stewart and Kevin. I mean, saying, let's just do something really crazy. Let's not tell people what to do. Let's just give them time to do what they want. So this institute was set up in 1930 by Abraham Flexner, who had been very discouraged as fighting the educational system, wrote a lot of manifestos. And the idea was that the best thing you could give people was time. And so the institute gives you time in two forms. If you're really great, you get the rest of your life. And if you're just very young and bright, you get 1 year. And they've learned that there's really no in between. If you let people stay 2 or 3 years, it's very hard to get them to leave. So you either get 1 year or you get your whole life. And last year, I was one of the people who got the year. So I got to go back there for a year and go through the papers. When von Neumann was brought to the institute, they weren't thinking about bombs or computers or game theory. He was invited because he was a logician doing, very useless pure logic, and this would be a place for him to work. Building the computer there was really sort of an embarrassment to this temple of pure thought, to have some engineers there actually building machines. So that when the project folded up, the papers were essentially locked in a vault in the basement, and I was the first person to really have access to go through all this stuff. There's my sister Esther, my older sister Katerina, and I so we grew up there. And to me, as a child, the von Neumann gang, they were my heroes. I mean, they were the guys who were fixing cars and building hi-fi stereos for people. And the fact that there were actually people there building something was I mean, the physicists just, scribbled on the blackboard. So for me, it was a chance to really go back and learn about these heroes. It was like going to Alaska and meeting the people who had designed kayaks. So when the institute started, they hired 3 people. First, they hired Veblen, who really was a great mathematician who did a whole lot to change American mathematics. But he also was leader of the ballistic group at the Aberdeen Proving Ground during World War I. So that's very important to setting the stage to why the Institute was so a good place for von Neumann to end up to do this work, because Veblen had been through the war and understood that this kind of number crunching was actually an important thing. Then they hired Einstein, who was sort of the figurehead who gave them respectability. And third, they hired von Neumann, who got to hang out right next to the tea room. He was a very social guy. And then they built this machine, completely breaking the normal way to do this kind of a project would be you would go find some big lab full of engineers like Bell Labs or maybe even Xerox or someplace like that. And you would bring in a few mathematicians who would tell the engineers that they wanted this computer, and the engineers would build it. Von Neumann did the total reverse. He went to this place that was full of Greek classical historians, medieval scholars, and logicians, and brought in 4 engineers. These 4 engineers who then built this machine. So it was a very strange way to do it, and the papers all survive. And they started with really, the only computer manual at that time was the maintenance manual for the ENIAC. Was really, looking through what they had in their library, that was it, and teletype manuals and so on. So they started from there. The ENIAC is often confused with the instant computer. The instant computer was the next generation after the ENIAC. The ENIAC was a calculator that only by sort of a real hack could be made to store any sort of instructions, whereas the Institute computer was the first computer that really was a logical device that stored its own instructions. And everything had to be just thought up from nothing. So here, things like an AND OR gate that we take totally for granted, they're sketching, how are we going to do an AND OR gate, and how are we going to do it with vacuum tubes? What kind of gates will we, how will they combine? How will we do things like shift registers, moving these numbers around, and do it all with very sloppy, fuzzy waveforms. None of this crisp, solid-state stuff. It's all vacuum tubes, and getting binary numbers to run on vacuum tubes was a tough thing. Here, we're figuring out how they're going to join the adder, and the SR is shift register, AR is arithmetic register, and that's really the guts. Every microchip you have now works the same way, but at that time they had to look at different ways of doing it, and this is one that somebody liked, that's one that somebody disliked, and the somebody was probably von Neumann, who came in about once a week to talk with the engineers. And this piece of paper is really this is like Moses coming back from the mountain with the first commandment. This really is the first commandment. Orders, let a word 40 binary digits. So they're not saying bits yet. They're saying binary digits. Be 2 orders. Each order is a command and an address. And that's really the origin of the command line, and of a very, very important distinction that up till this time, the mathematicians at a place like the Institute, they dealt with numbers. Numbers meant things, and the fundamental change here is now, really through this very profound sort of new concept, we have numbers that do things. And we're going to put numbers that mean things and numbers that do things in the same place. So, and that's what really started the whole big bang that brings us here today. When you actually allow numbers to go out and do things. And that's sort of the message, is that numbers have taken over the world, and they're doing, all this stuff we do is being done by these numbers. Oppenheimer came in as director in 1947. This is Robert Oppenheimer, whose brother built the Exploratorium here, and gave von Neumann a lot of support, because the biggest numerical problem they had was designing hydrogen bombs, and this was the machine that would do it. So that's really where the real support for the machine came from, the bomb side, even though von Neumann was very clear about doing a whole lot of other science with it as well. And on the bomb side, you were dealing with these very, very, very short time periods. What happens in a microsecond? It's all over in a few microseconds. But there was another side, which was the long-term side, predicting the weather, doing things like that, and von Neumann was also interested there. But Stan Ulam, Richard Feynman, von Neumann, really the 3 sort of bomb guys who got together and made a lot of the sense. So it was a wonderful quote. And all this was secret. So here now, finally, at least the Los Alamos guys are able to go to Princeton and say that they're from Los Alamos. It's not now. There were these people like Nick Metropolis just showing up in Princeton repeatedly, and everyone, what's he doing here? They were working on what became the Monte Carlo method of taking a very difficult problem and following just some statistical paths. So this was a very great problem for this new computer to do. This is actually the flow charts that were the first case this was done on the ENIAC before the Institute machine was even finished, and now printing out. So all the sort of things we still suffer with in computing today were all there at the very dawn. This is 1947. This new method is based on a vocabulary. So this is the first beginnings of computer language, a set of orders which is in 2 levels, the background coding and the problem coding. So that's really the first hint of an operating system. The conventional view has the sort of ENIAC at the root of everything, and the Institute IIS computer way up on one of the trunks. And part of that is because all this bomb stuff was secret. The historians didn't really, I think, know till more recently how. And so my job, in a sense, or my prejudice, is trying to move the IIS project further down on the trunk, which it really was. It was really very closely involved with the ENIAC from the beginning. The sort of smoke screen, what went in the press wasn't that we're building this machine to design bombs. It was going to be used for weather prediction, and it was used for weather prediction. And really everything, the fact that you can go to CNN and get a good 3-day forecast is actually the algorithms that were developed on this machine, which was bringing to life what Louis Richardson worked on in World War I, which was he proposed this imaginary computer of 64,000 people like yourselves in a giant theater, and each person would represent one cell in the global weather, and you would pass equations back and forth and solve them, and then he figured if you had 64,000 good mathematicians, you could do this fast enough to keep up with the weather itself. And he also did he was an electronics guy, and this was his model for. So this sort of answers the huge issue in computer science is the two religious issues are artificial intelligence and free will, and so he makes it clear that you can just with this simple thing you can have a mind that has free will but is only capable of two ideas, and everything else is just a question of degree. And von Neumann was also very clear to credit Alan Turing, who was the person who really, more than anyone, got all the ideas right in the first place. So Turing was in Princeton in 1936-37 when he wrote this great paper that really was the first to show that with any computing machine that can do arithmetic can do anything. It just may take a very long time. But you have to. The question has to be asked in a rigorous way. And so you can have problems where the question is very simple, but the answer is very hard to compute, so you have to build more processors, or you can have questions that are easy to compute, but the question is very hard to ask, and then you hire more programmers. And that's sort of the battle we've been in. We're now, it takes 12,000 programmers at Microsoft just to ask the question that your $4.99 computer can now answer, because the processors have gone way ahead of the programming. And Turing's ideas go back to Hobbes showing that you can always take these ideas back one step further. And Hobbes really formulated Turing's thesis, but in 17th century English, not the language of logic. That if you can do arithmetic, you can do logic, and if you can do logic, you can then, if you're just work step by step, you can do anything that you can think. And Hobbes owed a lot of this to Leibniz, who produced this manuscript written on a train in 1679, where he shows that you can do all this stuff with binary arithmetic, and you can do it even without wheels or gears or anything like that. You can do it with marbles running down tracks, which is something that so he is really inventing the shift register. The fact that if you can shift binary digits, you can do all this mathematics. And that's something that you could build, like at the Exploratorium, with 1 million ball bearings, and once a day you would solve a simple problem and all the kids could watch. It would be a really fun thing to do. So the shift register, that at the Institute they reinvented the shift register. They were really just reinventing what Leibniz did, but they were doing it with electrons, which move much faster. And now this is, so that's Leibniz in 1679, and that's von Neumann in 1945. So von Neumann is just picking up where Leibniz left off and trying to, how are we going to do an adder? They argued a lot. I mean, it was a big difference trying to do an adder with 6 vacuum tubes or 8 vacuum tubes or 9 vacuum. It all came down to how many vacuum tubes you needed, because they used a lot of power and they got hot. And then the key thing, you have an arithmetic unit, a central control memory. So that's the CPU, the RAM, and the input-output. And Willis Ware, who worked at RAND, really with the comment, I think sums it all up. The question of whether von Neumann deserves credit for all these ideas. No, he was sort of the orchestra conductor who put a lot of other people's ideas together. They weren't all his ideas. They weren't original. There were huge court cases over whether they were his ideas or not. And it really doesn't matter at this point. Some of the ideas, particularly on the hardware side, came from Vladimir Zworykin, the Russian in the middle there, who brought us television, particularly color television, worked for RCA. And the Institute originally, they said, well, we'll support this computer project as long as you don't build it here. And von Neumann said, well, we'll build it at RCA. And RCA said, Zworykin said, well, you build it here and we'll do all the electronics work. You won't need any guys with soldering guns at the Institute. You do the logic, we'll do the hardware. You do the software, we'll do the hardware side. And then RCA, of course, somebody came in from their patent department and said, well, if you're building this here, we want patents. And it all became very complicated. The end result was they moved the whole thing back to the Institute. And so this is again, the central key things to all the computing we do today. A clock running at a faster and faster cycle. The Institute clock was variable between 2 kilocycles and 16 kilocycles. Now we're into megacycles and gigahertz. And that words, which now are addresses, and orders are handled in memory just like numbers. So there's no distinction between data and instructions, and that's the key. That's what really starts the whole vicious circle where the thing takes off out of control. The key was memory. You had to have a place to. There's two kinds of bits in the universe. A bit is really any distinction you can make between two things, and there's bits that represent differences in time, and there's bits that represent differences in space. And all a Turing machine does, or any computer, is just translate between these two kinds of bits. Take sequences and put them into memory as structure, and take things out of memory and put them back into sequences. And if you can do that fast, you can do all kinds of things. But how do you do that with vacuum tubes? The RCA answer, this is Jan Reichman at RCA. RCA was going to do this, essentially an integrated circuit in a tube. This mock-up tube that never worked was going to originally contain 4,096 bits. So it really was essentially a memory chip in a tube. When they finally got it working, the version they finally got working was 256 bits. And those tubes are called Selectrons. Actually ran the RAND version of the Institute machine until 1970. So it was very effective. In a way, von Neumann that's in some ways why this old von Neumann architecture works so well on our microprocessors, because it really was designed from the beginning with the assumption that there would be this sort of plug-in memory chip as the basis of the machine. But doing it with glass and wire, and if it wasn't totally evacuated, it didn't work, took them about 3 years more than they had accounted for. So the Selectron didn't go, that's their budget. Those costs for the mathematicians, that's a mathematician for a year. That's $6,000 a year. And the computers are people who compute by hand. But you could get a lot in those days. You can see you could get Kurt Gödel for $2,400 a year. So $200 a month. And Erdos is $750 a year. So these, you could get a lot of mathematicians for $18,000. And you got the patent rights for nothing. I mean, this is Willis Ware, who probably, single-handedly did more patentable engineering things that are in the modern computer. But here he's selling all his patent rights to the Institute for $1. So it was an inexpensive project. But where to do it? The Institute had 3 floors. This was right after the war. The 4th floor was occupied by the League of Nations Economic Division, who had been kicked out of Geneva. And the economists, so all the historians had already been squashed down into the 3rd floor, and there were no other wings then. So the solution was to use this little closet next to Gödel's office. Gödel was distinguished enough. He had an office for a secretary, this little office with the arrow. But he was so nervous he didn't want a secretary, nearby. So that office was empty, and the computer project started there. So this very fundamental report on the logical architecture was done in Gödel's office. And there's a importance there because Gödel really had formulated, in some ways, the origins of software. It was Gödel's idea in 1930 and 31 that you could assign everything a number. You could take every concept you could ever think up and you could give it its own characteristic number. And then you could do arithmetic with those numbers. And that's really how he proved some of his inconsistency, incompleteness theorem. And that's really what software did, was assign everything an address. And now, if whatever OS you use, it's this huge, 100 million line number. And so Gödel's vision really came true. Then, when they brought the engineers in, actually, we've got to start building hardware and soldering things. They couldn't do that upstairs. So the administration says they can have the room next to the laboratory in the basement, which is very interesting. Is now, if you go down and find that room, it's where the routers are for the main institute. So it stayed in the business. But even then, the historians complained. This is Benjamin Merritt, who's the great Greek epigram. The engineers are moving into the basement. So then the budget starts going up. So it's $4,700, and then this is the camel's nose in the tent. The first $4 for electrical work. And so the core group, Julian Bigelow, who was Norbert Wiener's engineer who came down from MIT, Hermann Goldstein, who was the chief the head of the ENIAC project, Oppenheimer and von Neumann. So they had a tremendous sort of constellation of talent. People here, and these engineers when the project folded, they went out all over the world and really spread the sort of gospel of computing to all these other labs, to Illinois, to Israel, to Rand out here in Santa Monica, to, basically it really was the birth of the modern generation. And the software, the coding was done mainly by women who were very unrecorded, were paid very little, $275 a month, and actually wrote all the early programs and debugged them by hand, and it's really sort of a lost story. These guys were really the original nerds. Who got in trouble right away. So that's nothing's new. But the programmers got their revenge. The historical footnote to all this is if you go to the Institute today, and if you're a historian working on, trade in medieval Venice or something, and you're working late, finishing your manuscript, and you really want a cup of tea or coffee late at night, you have to go to the Shimoni building. It's the only building that's open 24 hours and has tea and coffee, and that's the building built by Charles Shimoni, the programmer. So now the historians the tables are reversed. But at that time, having people with soldering guns was completely out of bounds. And they really built this thing there, and doing it with this, trying to get binary behavior out of hot vacuum tubes was a very rare region where you get binary behavior. Most of it is a sloppy sort of never land. They used a lot of, shift register of 6J6 tubes. Most of the computer was 6J6s, which was a standard cheap radio tube. They found they were more reliable than buying more expensive tubes, just because so many of them were produced, they were more consistent. And all these architectures, which at that time was still, von Neumann saw the computer more as this sort of cellular system, that it hadn't yet been totally taken over and colonized by the order codes and the arithmetic unit. He saw this address matrix as things where you could do different architectures, and then it sort of crystallized into one very standard architecture. That's the total number of tubes. So you can, 3,474 tubes, which was at that time was very little. ENIAC had 18,000. And you know how rapidly tubes fail. So the mean time between failure was very low. The note at the bottom says, Fred, if you have time, please tighten all nuts. So, and then parallel to working on all this hardware, the software guys were already writing the software for the machine that didn't exist yet. So that if the machine ever got working, they would have codes to run on it. And all that stuff was published so that people in the other universities and labs could also start working at the same time. And that's what gave this whole thing a jump start. That if it had been done by the government, it would have been done very slowly. If it had been done in one of the industrial labs, there would have been patent issues and so on. So the idea of doing it in the institute was to just do it as science and distribute it freely. And then if you look at these reports, if you look at the interlibrary loan cards, you're seeing they're going to RCA, IBM, National Cash Register Company. So that's how the ideas spread. The machine itself was a beautiful work of engineering. It was elegant. It wasn't some big ungainly thing. It was essentially a microprocessor, but just large for the time. But it was built. Bigelow was a real classical engineer, so it was built like an engine. These are the sort of specifications: 40-bit words, used 16 kilowatts, which again was very little at that time. 24 microsecond addition time, so very, very, very fast. They're starting to build a magnetic drum at that time. The input-output is punch cards and teletype. There's one Neumann with those cylinders. The memory is all in those tubes. So when the Selectron didn't show up, what could they do with existing equipment? And that's James Pomeroy. He's also still alive. So he's holding what's a standard. They took a standard 5-inch oscilloscope tube and using the phenomena, like if you turn off your CRT monitor, there's some static on the screen for a minute or two. The static is slightly different on the bright spots versus the dark spots. So putting this amplifier on the face, you could go back and you could hit a bright spot and then it'll stay there for 100 milliseconds or something at maximum. And then you can go back to it, hit it again, and you get a little pulse of secondary current. So they found that they actually were able to store a 32 by 32 array. So, 1,000 kilobit on the face of one of these little tubes. But it became, it was very, very sensitive to electromagnetic disturbances and took very clever clock. So you have this millisecond clock doing the refreshing, and then you have this microsecond clock going back. And so it became the first random access memory. You could put a bit anywhere you wanted at any time and get it back out. You didn't have to wait for it in some kind of serial cycle. But the difference between a dot and a dash is this sort of very fuzzy distinction. I mean, that's the ideal, not the way it really is. And each tube has its own individual logbook page to keep track of its failures and idiosyncrasies. One of the failures was if there's this tiny speck of dust in the tube, it might stop working. And then the first thing you do is hit it with a hammer and try and shake the dust loose. And so the way this worked was the two companies that made these kinds of tubes shipped every tube they produced went to the Institute. And then they tested them, and they sent the 80% that weren't good back. And those went to normal guys putting them in oscilloscopes. But the Institute got sort of the cream of the crop. Input and output teletype equipment. So it took a long time to load the memory of the machine, which was like this, really built like a V40 engine, 20 cylinders on each side. And that's really how it worked. It was like a V40 engine with overhead valves and overhead cams. And the overhead is the arithmetic and the memory register and the shift registers, and down below is the memory. So and it had a lot of horsepower. It had 40,000 bits, which at that time, so that's exactly the memory of a Windows icon. It's exactly the number of bits in it. And so all this great science was done in just this. So if you look at it as a 3D matrix, it's 32 by 32 by 40 bits high. So this tiny little address space, whereas now, this computer has 100,000 times the memory, and we're all connected together in this great. So this was the wire drive, the ancestor of the disk drive, trying to get stuff in faster than teletype using magnetic wire on bicycle wheels. But that's the sort of waveform. So you're still dealing with this very fuzzy digital information. If you start going too fast, you'll lose bits. Then they went to a magnetic drum, which was more reliable. This is circuits for starting to use, they were rewiring IBM machines, which was illegal, getting IBM machines. And first IBM came down to like, you know, throw the book at them and take the equipment back. And then the guy said, hey, wait a minute, these guys are really doing something. We might make money on this. And they sure did. And all the different forms of input and output. And they did graphics. So this is 1948. One of the things, they'd got the memory register going, but the computer wasn't running yet, but they started outputting it as a bitmap into the cathode ray tube. So that's, as far as I know, the first computer graphics. And now you see Industrial Light and Magic, how far they've gone with just those few bits. And so the situation was the reverse of today. You know, we're looking at a screen that's pixels that are just a representation of the memory that's somewhere else. And in this time, the memory actually was the pixels on the face of the tube. So the display started out as the memory, and then later the display became the display. But they're right away realizing we can actually display. And von Neumann is thinking very far ahead about, you know, he knows that all these vacuum tubes are going to fail every few minutes. The hardware is sloppy, but how can we do reliable? How can we organize this sloppy stuff into reliable computers? And that, in a sense, it was a problem that if we hadn't got this really reliable solid-state equipment, we would have gone farther with von Neumann's ideas. But nobody really needed those ideas once we got reliable computers. The guys back at the institute in the lab getting this thing to work, they had to get it running with the sort of mean time between failures was about 8 minutes. Very long loading time, 2 minutes running, 90 minutes loading from IBM. The constant question, every time there was a failure, every computation was done twice. It was duplicated, and if these hexadecimal codes are checksums for the entire memory, you keep a checksum. And if the memory was not in the same state, if you didn't get the same answer and had the memory in the same state after doing it the second time, you did it a third time, or a fourth time, or a fifth time. And then you tried to figure out, was it human or machine? The memory was always going bad. I mean, the memory, you know, there'd be days when the memory wouldn't work. It would turn into garbage. You would lose that distinction between the normal dot and a normal dash. And then you had to figure out which tube was it. There's 40 tubes. A lot of no use went home. And no manuals. And they kept track of those. The beautiful thing is that someone had the sense to save these logbooks. So all this was new. Every calculation was logged. They just called it general arithmetic, which was mainly bomb calculations, but they don't tell. And then occasionally a demonstration for Dr. von Neumann. The machine was originally known as the Maniac. They were making fun of the ENIAC, so it was a mathematical numerical integrator and calculator. But then the Institute was embarrassed by that, so they said stop calling it the Maniac. But the Los Alamos, so then the copy that was built at Los Alamos became known as the Maniac. Machine or human? There was always a question. And there were some people had very good instincts. Hedy Selberg, one of them could really tell, was it a code problem or was it a hardware problem? Found the trouble in the code. Code error, machine not guilty. And MC is master control. And then there's mechanical problems, burning V-belts and things that you really don't have to suffer today. And here the IBM machine is putting a tar-like substance on the cards. The tar is actually tar from the roof melting. The air conditioning is failing. And this one's a little hard to read, but a mouse, this is 4:50 in the morning. So the bomb calculations ran all night. The bomb calculations and the sort of artificial life stuff ran all night long. So a mouse climbed into the blower behind the regulator rack, set blower to vibrating. Result, no more mouse and a heck of a racket. And here lies mouse, born, died 4:50 a.m., May 26th. And one of the engineers has written, here lies Marston mouse, which is a dig at Marston Morse, who was one of the pure mathematicians who had objected to the computer being built at the Institute. And so this is high speed, so high speed was 16 kilocycles. You could dial the speed up. It was not like our computers that just run at a fixed speed. You could actually pedal it one click of the clock at a time. If things weren't working right, you could just go click, 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 and follow these marbles as they fell down the shift registers. Low speed was 2 kilocycles. And here, the guy complained, you've now duplicated both results. So what if you get the same different results twice? Now, this is the third different output. I know when I'm licked. Machine ran fine, code isn't. That's really the story of our lives. And occasionally everything went fine. And they did work on meteorology. They did a lot. After the bombs came first, then came meteorology, then came stellar evolution and things like that. But this was very ambitious, to try and predict the weather using 5,000 bytes of memory. So it's January 1954. They're still trying to get a forecast for November 6, 1953. So they basically, the short story of the weather program was they spent 6 years trying to predict a hurricane that had already happened and running and rerunning the same thing. But they did pretty well. So here they've got a 1-hour forecast finally. And, that's the real and that's the predicted. And they got them to match up. We don't know how many, lesser results weren't published, but they were also fighting the real weather. Princeton, New Jersey is probably the worst place to try and do sensitive electronics. It's damp, it's insufferably hot, humid, thunderstorms. So thunderstorms would completely wipe out the memory for days. Now they're trying to do a 3-level forecast, 24 hours. And these started to actually work. So the fact that you get them today is really a credit to these pioneers. Then they did evolution of stars, which was similar. It was irresistible. Once you had the stuff in place to do bombs, you could actually do stars. So they're looking at the evolution of how stars evolve over millions of years. And then to keep the historians happy, who were probably still complaining, they ran the whole astronomical clock backwards to do this great table of positions of stars and planets in the time that the historians were interested in. So historians could go back to an old account that said, well, Jupiter was here when such happened, and figure out dates. And they even did traffic problems, looking at if you were going to build freeways, how could you do lane changes and interchanges and optimize traffic flow, sort of the beginnings of network optimization. And then they also did bombs, which were not supposed to be in the logbooks, but here somebody sketched an explosion. And they did, most interesting to me, and this is sort of going to lead into the future, when Neumann invited anybody who had a really interesting problem. He said, well, come here and you can have machine time and do it. So Niels Baricelli, who was a mathematical biologist who was a viral geneticist, he wrote a proposal to come and do genetic experiments, actually put numbers in the computer and try and let them have these cycles all night from 12 midnight till 8 in the morning, and see if they would evolve. See if you could actually create an artificial universe in which numbers would become more complex. Very, very way ahead of his time. So again, to do this with the memory they had was hopelessly ambitious. So the year is 1953. It's the year that the structure of DNA has been elucidated by Watson and Crick and Franklin. And so it's working from the opposite direction. The molecular biologists are trying to decode the code that brought things to life. And Baricelli is going the other way, saying, well, I'm just going to start with this very pure matrix and try and encode something and see if it grows and becomes lifelike. So just starting with this matrix of binary numbers and letting things emerge. And he had a great rapport with the computer. The other people would work in teams, and they would have to have engineers, but often the logbooks, Baricelli comes on at midnight and no problems till 8 in the morning when the other guys show up. So here, I'm not going to read these, but this gives you a picture of what he was seeing this already. In 1953, he was seeing the digital universe as a universe with its own laws and possibly eventually its own forms of life. And so he ran all these generations. He would have to stop to let the other guys come on the machine, and then he would restart his projects and kept going. As long as he had access to the machine, he kept these things running. And these are the results. They look a lot like what we see from Wolfram these days, or more recently. And he published this. It's not unknown. It just was published in journals that other people didn't read, and it was just too far ahead of its time and was sort of forgotten. And he had a sense of humor. He saw that, people would not take you seriously if you said you were going to try and create life. If it's that easy, why don't you do it yourself? But he asked some very good questions because he was a biologist. He looked at real viruses and he saw what could happen in the computer as similar to the sort of parasitic. The first stage would be parasites, like the simplest life forms we know are parasites. And he saw that the universe would have to stay diverse. He didn't have a big enough universe, so he ran multiple universes and then let them exchange code. So as far as the universe was concerned, it didn't know that it was being stopped and restarted. And so one day he would run one universe and another day another one, and then on the third day put the two together. And all sorts of interesting things happened. I mean, was he mad or was he a visionary? It's hard to say. He output all this on IBM cards. Here he sees a virus starting to infect the cards. So that's, I think, as far as I know, the first computer virus infected IBM cards. And so the output was in the form of these beautiful. He arrayed the IBM cards out. So this was sort of a printout of the memory, and then photographed, contact printed it on a blueprint machine, and these things survive. So he would look at this and say, "Oh, here's a parasite, and here's a thing." We can't really see it. We have to have his interpretation of it. So these are different rules. He's sort of setting, and he says very clearly that you have to resist the temptation of changing the rules of the universe halfway through. You have to just let the universe go at its. It either works or it doesn't. You can't play God and change the rules halfway through. So here he's going, a couple thousand generations, but he realizes no matter what you do, these numbers, they're just numbers in the computer. They're just genes. They have no phenotype. They're not doing anything. And what he saw was that you had to let these numbers go out and do something. And actually, that's what happened in the real world. That the certain codes became useful for doing arithmetic, and they got distributed to other computers to do more arithmetic, and eventually a code became a word processor, and everybody had to have word processors, and then came VisiCalc, and everything went from there. And that's really what Baricelli imagined happened in the real world, that these numbers were able to do useful things in the real world and get reproduced for doing useful things. And numbers became money, and numbers became music, and pornography, and all the other things that have propagated so well are actually in the universe inside the computer. They just are these patterns of numbers. And he saw, of course, the amazing analogies between that and how the world of RNA and DNA evolved. He had I think, a theory about the evolution of DNA that I think is still very plausible. That he saw nucleotides as being, he saw everything as alive. It was sort of like Richardson's mind only capable of two ideas, that even molecules had a certain life of their own, and that these nucleotides were like social insects that went out and collected amino acids and brought them back to their nest, sort of like ants, and that these very advanced molecules, you wonder, how could a molecule like that ever evolve, sort of evolve like colonies of social insects? And that really what he's seeing here is exactly what we do today, that we send computer applications to each other we transmit programs between computers. And he's sort of looking at it the other way around. And is this beginning of life? He never saw what he was doing as sort of simulating life. It wasn't sort of SimCity kind of thing. This was the beginnings of something new and something else. And he saw evolution itself as a computational process. And I think that's one of the key long now ideas, that our whole Darwinian evolutionary system really is a big computer. It's doing a massively parallel computation that is solving certain very difficult problems. How do you fly? How do you swim? How do you think? How do you have children? Those are all problems that evolution solves by doing this exchange of information, and that has its own intelligence. It has sort of a mind of its own. And Barricelli, he in a way was mad, thinking that at some point these two forms of intelligence might become aware of each other. And that's, again, it's hard, you're dangerous ground to say that, but that's something like that is going on with computing today. That we're starting to process massive amounts of biological genetic information in computers, and these two universes actually are starting to communicate. There's people running codes on their desktops that are actually now coding for proteins and becoming drugs and becoming DNA, and eventually, some point, will become living organisms. So he saw this, that the germs of this were starting. This was his last published paper before he died. It was sort of a very frightening title. That, what if these things developed their own language and technology? And he really saw the process in the computer as repeating what had happened originally with the origins of life. When I went to the Institute and started digging through this stuff, there were these defined, known 7 boxes of Neumann material, and then on the last day I was there, my first visit, the archivist said, "Mr. Dyson, I think we found another box." It was a box that was completely black with dust, and the top was World War II teletype repair manuals, and in the bottom were these boxes of the IBM cards for one of Barricelli's universes with the source code for the whole thing. So it's all there, like it's like the mosquito in the amber for Jurassic Park. It's preserved with the instructions to the engineers on how to run this drum code, because they would run it for him. And it would take a lot of deciphering to figure this out, but I think you could actually recode this on some kind of emulator and end up with a screensaver or something. And then the note from the engineers, there must be something about this code that you haven't explained yet. And that's what von Neumann was thinking about. When von Neumann died, he died tragically young. I think he was pacing himself to have another 30 years. He went to work for the Atomic Energy Commission to sort of try and solve the "are we going to blow up the world" problem. And then he resigned from the Institute. He accepted a position at UCLA under the condition that he could bring in biologists. He was going to bring a lot of biologists to UCLA and do computational biology. What survives from that were his unfinished notes for his theory of self-reproducing automata, which is interesting. A chapter title is Turing and then Not Turing. So he knew both the power of the Turing machine and that there was something beyond the Turing machine, that biology was doing something else. And I think he was going to combine the two into a unified theory that he wasn't going to publish till it was complete. His last lecture was published as A Computer in the Brain, which people have, I think, sort of misinterpreted that he was saying computers are like brains and brains are like computers. He was more interested in the question of how do brains with all this very sloppy hardware, very sloppy, slow hardware, do very reliable, fast computations, and why do computers with more reliable hardware fail? So he was looking at how the brain operated differently with this language that was not at all digital, it was statistical. And I think that's, again, one of the messages for the future, is that we've been so successful with this strictly deterministic digital computation, where every address is strictly defined, like that original matrix, and our codes are exactly, they either they work or they have bugs, but there's totally other forms of computation, which is how the brain does it, with just a very statistical approach, what von Neumann called pulse frequency coding, where it's important there's no language or code. It's just a case of what is connected to what and how fast is the pulse rate. It's more like music. It's a pulse frequency thing, and I think that's what, if the Internet as a whole is doing any kind of computation, that's one of the levels it could be happening. Sort of what's connected to what is important. Brewster is a good example of that. Really looking at I guess what Alexa did. I mean, we sort of established some metrics of what you're connected to and how often you connect counts. And if you start accounting for that, you get very interesting behavior. And that's essentially what the brain does. And that's probably why music resonates so much with us, because somehow music brings to life the ability to keep track of all these different pulse codings and sense of time and build sort of this longer now. If you hear a really great symphony, the guy who wrote the symphony had to conceive that whole temporal thing at once. So, but Neumann was, I think, going to synthesize a lot of that with technology and biology. It's I think, a big part of the future of computing is to build systems, whether we do it consciously or whether it happens naturally, systems that are very large and very robust and free from the coding failures that sort of plague our normal or some of our day-to-day computing. So I think he was going to synthesize these two together. He also had done amazing, a whole lifetime's work in game theory and economics, which is another way of looking at the same question. Why are economic systems so robust and reliable? That's Oscar Morgenstern, his collaborator. And then the sort of Bill Joy side of things. Can we survive this stuff that we create? Once we know how to blow up the world, how do we socially avoid doing it? And then he left for the Atomic Energy Commission, so the Institute was facing, what do we do with this? Von Neumann started this project, and what von Neumann wanted to do was create a department of computer science. And okay, now we have the computer. We don't need to invent the computer again. We've invented it, but let's bring in scientists and work on all these problems we can solve with computing. And the Institute, basically, the decision was no. And this was one of the answers from the review committee. Which is what von Neumann wanted to do. He wanted to go ahead and revolutionize all these other fields with the power of computing. So by then, the computer at the Institute had become more or less routine. All troubles were code troubles, which is sort of the machine had stabilized and the problems were mainly in the software. Finally, they pulled the plug. So July 15th, midnight, 1958, Julian H. Bigelow, he runs the last calculation, was actually a physics problem, and they pull the plug and turn it off. Bigelow's the guy in the middle, really made the thing happen. He was the guy who could build things, had, very much understood, I think as most people on that project did, they didn't foresee the personal computer revolution or anything like that, but they knew that the world would never be the same once the ability to calculate so quickly got loose in the world. And that's the world we live in today. And where it goes from here, despite how I was introduced, my view of the future is that it's so interesting. All we need to do is wait and see. That predictions, predictions are very hard. We can see that. So all I can really tell you is that these numbers are, in my view, they're alive and they have a life of their own inside all these machines. And despite our best efforts, we can speed that up and we can help. And many of us in this room have done things that have really helped those numbers leap ahead in their evolution. But they are on their own path, and it's going to, what's happened with the internet and so on is going to change the world as much as what happened at the Institute 50 years ago. And predictions are very hard to do. But there's two sides to things. There's the universe inside the computer. So you can look at those numbers are living their lives, trying to be, the best thing they can do is be useful. If they're useful, if they can solve a problem, they will get reproduced and they will get to go out and mate with other code and propagate and do all these things that these numbers want to do. And then from our side, there's the much larger architectural side, that we are plugging all these computers together and wireless and barcoding every last item in the universe, which again, Gödel had suffered under this horrible Austro-Hungarian bureaucracy where everybody would, take a number and wait. And I'm sure that's where some of the germs of his ideas about numbering everything. And now we live in a world that would have been, Gödel would have, he was viewed as paranoid, but if he had saw this happening, he would have truly been paranoid. That we number everything. Every box of Cheerios, everything has a number, and all these numbers are accounted for. And that's the larger world where the whole computational system is actually attached to real things and doing real things. And that's Stan Ulam's eulogy for von Neumann, that he died in 1954, or 1957, so at age 54. So he just saw, he saw the promised land, but he didn't get to live in it, which is a great tragedy. I'm going to end talking about really I think the patron saint of the Long Now Foundation, who is Robert Hooke, who, like Danny Hillis, who was here last night but not tonight, was a clockmaker and a microscopist. He looked at the very small, he looked at the very large. He gave this wonderful talk to the Royal Society on an explanation of memory, how the organs made use of the mind may be mechanically understood. So memory is the key thing. It's the key to Long Now. It's the key to computers working. And this is sort of the Turing machine, that thinking, you have to have a memory, and you have to have, he called it the soul, which is really the processor. You have to be able to have a processor that can process bits that go in and out of memory. And the way he saw it was as a spiral, that the soul is at the center and your memories collect in this big spiral, and you have a sense of time by sort of how thick the spiral is between you and the real world. And now, we live in this world that Hooke imagined, where, in our, if you really want to give someone, you'll give them a CD-ROM, which is this incredible, really like an old phonograph record in a way. A spiral of information that represents something that maybe your life's work over a lot of time compressed into this digital memory. And Long Now, I think, is working very creatively already and more creatively in the future, what Brewster's doing of preserving these memories, so we essentially have a collective organism that is remembering everything, for better or worse. The email that you didn't want, somebody else still has, and sooner or later, they can go to Brewster and they can get it back. And is that good? Is that bad? Do we have the processing power to make use of that? We don't now, but the searching is sort of getting, as fast as storage is getting larger, searching is getting better. So this whole thing is growing into a very large, enormous system. Astronomical number of Turing machines all reading each other's tapes, and then somebody like Brewster saying, I'm going to collect all the tape, and it's going to be there forever. And that really changes the game. Richard Waller, who published this, had to, this was a delicate time. He had to make sure he put in a disclaimer that he wasn't trying to, usurp the power of the soul. And Hooke's final thought, which is that different creatures have a different sense of time. Some computers run at 2 kilocycles and some run at 2 gigahertz, and they're going to have this different sense. Like a fruit fly lives a week, we live 80 or 100 years. The idea of the sensible moment, that we're each aware of we're sort of given this sensible moment, and some kinds of organisms might have a much larger, longer sensible moment than we do. And that's going to be a real problem. If we ever do contact other intelligences in the universe, it would be an exceptional, it would be remarkable if they happened to speak English. And it would be even more remarkable if they happened to think at the same time scale we think at. We're very limited by the time scale we think at. And the intelligence could well be out there just thinking very, very much faster or very, very much slower, and it wouldn't mean anything to us. So clocks are important because clocks are sort of this common pacing time, and that's what Long Now is here to do, and I'm delighted I was invited, and now we can have questions. Thank you. Mike.
Thank you, George. While you're writing questions and handing them to the guys in yellow hats to bring them up to the front, I'll just mention a brief pitch that next month, February 13th, in this same room, finally if we get the same space, Jim Dewar from RAND. One never hears from people at RAND. This is a guy who's been with RAND for 25 years and is now in charge of a brand new institute with a great deal of funding, whose job is to think from 25 to 200 years in time span. And he's bringing some methodologies which are basically new and very interesting. And he'll be here talking about long-term policy analysis. Then for the thrill seekers, March 12th, second Friday of March, Rusty Schweickart, the Apollo 8 astronaut, will be here talking about the work he's done for the last 2 years, figuring out the asteroid threat over the next 100,000 years, moving this 10,000-year time frame into its proper order, and what one does about it. And this is pretty interesting because you're starting to really think actuarially over the very long time frame and look at the power law. Here we have earthquakes in the Bay Area. Asteroids hit from time to time, and they change everything. And in order to do something about it, you have to think long-term and be able to act long-term and head them off. A question I have, just to start, George, is to go back to your title and Richard Feynman reference. I mean, at the end of Richard Feynman's talk, at least a decade or so later, people were ready to go out and start inventing nanotechnology. What really is this space that you see at the top that has plenty of room, and what should people do with it?
Well, I think people are doing a lot with every day. I mean, obviously the Internet is the greatest, most obvious example, just connecting. We had all these processors and suddenly they're all connected together into this much larger system. But then within that, all sorts of things can grow. I mean, the ability is there now to, monitor ecosystems, monitor technology. Really the world is open in a way. I think life has opportunities it hasn't had for, since the Cambrian explosion or so on, to move into totally new spaces. Obviously, the genetic side is extremely important. The fact that we are sequencing all these genetic sequences and putting them into computers and manipulating them, and they're going to start coming out. In 1959, when Feynman gave that talk, computer memory was $1 a bit for high-speed memory, and that's now the cost of DNA memory now is way, way less than that. I mean, if you pick up Science magazine, the classifieds in the back pages, it's now in the order of 10 or 20 cents a bit to read and write into real DNA, and you can just do that with a credit card. You don't need a lab or anything else, and that's an amazing thing. We own two big funds of information. We've got the information in our minds and the information in our DNA. And computers started out, reading and writing very slowly into our minds. And the mouse was a big advance. You could really read what the person wanted to do a lot quicker than typing and so on. And it's going back and forth. The screens get better, so that the bandwidth is greatly increasing. And very much the same with DNA. A few years ago, we were reading DNA, but we weren't writing it. And now we're really quickly reading and writing fluently between and the important thing about DNA, of course, DNA can be turned into proteins. So that world of life, life used our genetic system in order to further its own, whether you say it's agenda or whatever, but replication was very useful for life. The ability to actually replicate information led to the complexity of life forms. And life is, I think, going to take over this ability to do even more faithful replication in ways we can only imagine. Who are the companies who are going to do that? They're going to do it in small bits and pieces. Particularly in medical fields for medical applications and so on. But it's if you look at where we are now, I think it's very similar to where Feynman was in 1959. He's saying this is possible. Now you guys go out and do it. And it's the same with the opportunities for good and bad. There's obviously downsides. I don't know if that answers your question, but and in the computational world, there's just room for very different kinds of computation to happen. It's like the von Neumann matrix is there, and you can spend your whole life just doing spreadsheets in Windows. But if you're young and creative, you could do totally different things with it. And there's examples of that, but predicting what it will be that will suddenly, who would have said, maybe somebody would have, Napster or something like that. Gee, just template seeking information exchange would be so successful. And that's how biology does it, is by addressing, not by fixed address, but by template. I want the next molecule that comes along and fits my template, I'm going to grab it. And that's what, Napster does. The next person who's got that song, I'm taking it. And now it's songs, but it could also be programs or code that would do anything else you want it to do. The sort of soup is out there, and there's an opportunity to develop things that use that soup.
Another question is from Bob Spence. Could Bob Spence stand up so George can direct it to you? Okay, great. He said, history is written by the victors. Digital computing won. But where did analog computing fit into the history of it all?
Analog computing survived a long time. I mean, there's still some things that are done by analog computers, but digital just... Well, we know what happened to digital. What happened to analog? I mean, places like Convair, in my last research on this Orion project, the dynamics problems of how do you have this 3-mass, 2-spring oscillating system, they still, into the late, in the 1970s, they did that. That was better done on analog computers, just big rheostat banks. But what happened to those machines now, I don't know. But there's still, I think, a few things that are done, with things that actually are analog computers. The Bay model is a fantastic analog computer. Yeah, and we could now do that in code, but when they did it, it would have been impossible. So I hope that some of the computer museum people are saving some of that stuff.
So this is a related question by Roger Anderson. Could you stand so we could? There you go. He says, what fundamental ideas of computer design were not anticipated by von Neumann? That is, if modern electronics were known in 1946, how well would the Institute have done?
So you're saying if they had modern hardware, would... Yeah, I think... I think they would have done an awful lot more, but I think it would have been the same. I think, or my short answer is I think they would have done more of the same. The coding would have been able to be a lot more efficient. They had to always break these big problems into little tiny pieces and run a piece and take it out of memory and put another piece in. If they had a larger, more reliable memory, there's things in von Neumann's or the notes and journals. Saying that we're never going to be able to have programs longer than some ridiculous lines of code. They would fail. They didn't think anything would be able to stay in memory that long without collapsing.
More specifically, I'm wondering what fundamental ideas of computer hardware did they not anticipate that are now used in common?
I can't think of any. If you can think of any, it seems to me that all the basic same way we run things now was running then. It just was a whole lot slower and smaller. And they didn't have the input output. But what was going on in the machine was essentially the same. They were doing sort of reduced instruction set. There were a lot of later instructions. Instructions went way higher, and then they came back lower again. But it's quite amazing how some of those order codes are still the same. They're just very tenacious. And whether that's an accident or just because it's so difficult to change things once you start coding it. And, they did things 80 bits wide because that's how many holes you could punch on a card, and we just have kept that stuff.
Here's a question from John Cornwell. Where is he? That's you. You hound, you're writing your own questions. That's great. Question is, what drew you to these figures in history? And are there current figures or projects that captivate you in the same way? And if so, why?
Okay, I was drawn to these guys, as I explained, because they were there at the Institute building something. And to me, as a kid who wanted to build things, and my dad couldn't, he would not be able to tell you where the spark plugs were on a car. So these guys who knew how to run machine tools and plug wires together, they were my heroes. So I'm just fascinated by them. And I think it's the same with my later project, which was Project Orion, where these guys were going to build a spaceship. I just admired the people who worked in teams and wanted to build things. And what's next, I really don't know. But I'm fascinated by any of these sort of people who were the pioneers who broke the rules and got something done.
So another question from Roger Smith. Okay. I heard Donald Knuth recently say that the reason he doesn't use email is that he doesn't want to keep on top of things, but rather get to the bottom of things. What are your views on ways of improving selectivity, quality over quantity, of information?
What was the last sentence?
What are your views on ways of improving selectivity, that is, quality over quantity, of information?
Yeah, I think Don is right. You know, if you stop reading your email, you're only going to hear from people who really have something important to say, and they'll find you or call you up. I mean, maybe you'll miss something, but I think that selectivity is very. It's a good thing. I'm not very good at it, but I admire him for taking that approach. It sounds like Niels Baricelli, who up till he died in 1993, but he still did everything on punched cards. He said he didn't trust any other form of recording digital data. He wanted to know where every bit was all the time. He didn't like them, shifting around and escaping on him. So he kept it all on punched cards, and probably, of course, kept his coding very pure and elegant as a result.
Another question, a little bit more personal, from David Reinhardt. Okay. How did living with David Brower as a young man affect your perception of the world, if at all?
Tremendously. I mean, David Brower was one of the, if I had to name sort of three influential people, next to my own father, I think he was almost next. I mean, the Browers basically adopted me when I was, 16 years old and homeless, and they brought me into their household here in the East Bay and introduced me to people who became very important in my life. And I owe David. I mean, he sort of extracted my first book from me when I didn't even know there was a book there. So he was a very inspirational character. Died a few years ago, but had obviously a tremendous effect on California, on the Bay Area, and was a fantastic mountaineer. I mean, who taught me really that you have to be good at something no matter what. I mean, you can be the great political conservationist, but still you need to be a mountaineer, and so.
While I wait for additional questions, I have a question of my own. So, speaking of long now views, we have the benefit of your great research, which is based on the fact that all these guys kept meticulous notes on paper, and they were saved. These days, many corporations aren't even allowed to keep their email, where most of the communication is being done. So do you have any suggestions about ways in which we can take a long-term view of the future historians looking back, in keeping accounts of what we're doing now?
Okay, I mean, on the one hand, write stuff down and don't throw it out. And on the other hand, it looks very, very dangerous that we're having this period where it's too easy to throw stuff out, and we're not writing it down, and what's going to happen. So you can take a very dark view that there's going to be this lost period of history when the disks have evaporated and there's no records. On the other hand, we are saving a lot of stuff. It's becoming cheaper. It's cheaper now to store stuff than to make the decision to throw it out. So we're actually saving. There aren't these filing cabinets that have to be thrown out because people don't have room. There's these disks that just get forgotten, and hopefully there will be, I think, amateur scholars and stuff who will, save hard drives out of the landfills and take them apart and find, Monica Lewinsky's diary or something that is valuable, and the stuff will be saved that people thought was thrown out. But in archaeology, it's often the wrapping paper, the broken pottery that was used to pack something else is in the end the most valuable. I think there's a lot of that going on. But it's a shame to lose the paper. The smell of paper is a wonderful thing, and books are great. And luckily we have librarians and we have people who are passionate about keeping that stuff.
Sure enough, the digital teaches us to value analog. Thank you, George Dyson. Thank you all for coming tonight. Hope to see you next month.